My name is Gerald Myers. I'm 82 years old, and until recently, I lived alone in the same old house in Windham County, Vermont, where I was born and raised. The house has changed little in the past 60 years. It creaks in winter and smells of pine floor polish in summer. My wife Margaret used to say it had a soul, that every floorboard had a memory, and I used to laugh at that, though in recent years I've found myself talking to the walls and expecting them to answer back. She passed away 3 years ago in her sleep, a quiet death that followed 6 months of chemo, hair loss, and her steady transformation from the vibrant, no-nonsense nurse she once was into a husk of herself. I held her hand the night she died and said nothing, because after 49 years of marriage there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been lived. Since then, the house has grown quieter in a way that felt different than mere absence. It became hushed, as if it were watching me, waiting. Mornings were the hardest. Margaret always got up first, brewed the coffee, fried eggs exactly the way I liked them, over medium, no runny yolk, and turned on the little kitchen radio that buzzed AM talk shows. Now I make coffee myself, though I sometimes forget the ratio and end up with a bitter mess. I stopped using the frying pan altogether. Breakfast is cereal or toast, something that doesn't remind me she's gone. I have a routine. It's the only thing keeping the fog from setting in. Get up at 6:30, stretch, dress, coffee, newspaper, walk to the mailbox by 7:30, call into the VFW radio hour if I feel chatty, maybe drive into town for groceries if the fridge is low. I no longer drive at night, not since my depth perception started getting worse. My daughter, Melissa, used to call once a week, every Sunday at 2 p.m. sharp like a government-issued check. I would sit by the phone, waiting. Some weeks she didn't call at all, always blaming work or the kids or the time difference. Melissa lives in Albany now. She's 48, successful, runs some consulting firm that handles strategic asset reallocation, whatever that means. She used to be warm when she was younger, sunny, idealistic, a vegetarian in high school who rescued stray cats and wrote poetry in the margins of her textbooks. But after college and a short-lived marriage to a man I never liked, she hardened. Became lean in more ways than one. I hadn't seen her in almost a year. Not since Thanksgiving, when she came up with her boyfriend Alan, bland, condescending, mid-50s, slicked back hair, and spent most of the afternoon on her phone. That day she asked if I had considered selling the house and moving somewhere with medical support. I told her I didn't need a nurse. She laughed and said it wasn't about now, but preemptive placement, as if I were some chess piece she needed off the board. Margaret would have slapped her for that. Melissa is not cruel. She's practical, and practicality, I've come to learn, can be its own kind of cruelty. I do not have many friends left. Charles, my neighbor of 30 years, moved to Arizona last year to live with his son. Frank, from the Legion, passed away in March. Our Thursday poker games dissolved after that. I talk more to my mailman than to my family. I'm not lonely, though. That's something younger people don't understand. Loneliness implies longing. I don't long for anything. I've had my life, my love, my work. I was a high school history teacher for 41 years. Taught everything from the American Revolution to the Cold War. I used to wear a tweed jacket and slam the chalk down on the blackboard for effect. The kids called me General Myers behind my back. I took pride in that. What I hadn't expected was how fragile the social fabric becomes after retirement. You stop being useful, and people stop seeing you. You become the old man who used to teach, who walks stiffly to the diner every Tuesday and orders the same damn sandwich. I still mow my lawn myself, slowly and with long rests, but it gets done. There's dignity in persistence, even if no one notices. Melissa once offered to send a landscaper. I said no. She thought I was being proud. She didn't understand that I was being alive. I received fewer and fewer holiday cards over the years. My grandchildren, Emma and Cole, are now in college, somewhere down south, I think in Virginia. I haven't seen them since Margaret's funeral. They sent a card that Christmas, unsigned, clearly printed from a template with a pre-written "Happy Holidays from the Myers family." No note, no photo. I told myself not to be hurt, that this is the way of the world now. Fast, digital, shallow. I keep that card anyway, on the fridge, held by red apple magnet. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night and forget that Margaret is gone. I reach out and feel the cold side of the bed and remember all over again. The weight of that remembering is heavier than grief itself. And yet I endure. That's what old men do. We outlive our usefulness, our wives, our friends, and then we linger as silent reminders of what used to be. We don't die easily, not because we're strong, but because we have nowhere else to go. We persist out of habit. The idea that someone might one day forget I existed haunts me more than death. Margaret used to say, "You'll be remembered, Gerald. You taught generations." But memory is fickle. My name has already been removed from the school plaque I once hung. New donors, new priorities. The past is a burden to institutions. Only people carry it, and even then, only for a while. I thought Melissa would remember. I thought, at the very least, she would keep my stories alive. But I was wrong. All of this is to say, I was not prepared for what happened next. Not emotionally, not intellectually. You live a quiet life long enough and you begin to believe that nothing shocking can reach you anymore. You begin to believe you are safe from betrayal because you have nothing left to steal. You think the worst is behind you. But I've learned, even at 82, that betrayal isn't about what's taken. It's about who takes it, and what that reveals about everything you thought was true. And so, when I opened the Sunday paper and saw my name, Gerald A. Myers, age 82, survived by his daughter, Melissa Myers of Albany, New York, preceded in death by his wife, Margaret. I did not feel fear, not at first. I felt confusion. Then, something colder. Something like confirmation, as if the world had finally agreed with what Melissa had quietly believed for years, that I was already gone. The moment I saw my name in the obituary section of the Windham Gazette, everything inside me stilled. It wasn't panic, not immediately. It was a numb, sinking disbelief, like hearing your own echo and realizing it doesn't match the sound you made. The paper lay flat on my kitchen table, the same table Margaret and I had breakfast at for decades, and right there beneath a bolded headline that read, "In Loving Memory," was a paragraph outlining the details of a man who was, unmistakably, me. Gerald A. Myers, born July 13, 1943. Resident of Windham County. Retired schoolteacher, beloved husband of the late Margaret Myers, father of Melissa Myers of Albany. Recently passed peacefully at age 82 in his sleep at the Golden Pines Care Home. Services will be private. No public memorial. I read the paragraph 3 times, my heart beating louder with each pass. I wasn't just dead. I had been declared dead in a facility I had never even set foot in. I sat back in the chair, the wood creaking under me, and stared at the window, where light filtered through the lace curtain Margaret had sewn herself. Outside, everything looked the same. The maple tree stood tall. The birds chirped at the feeder, but something irreversible had shifted in the air. I stood up slowly and went to the drawer near the sink where I kept the phone book, an old habit one Melissa used to mock. Flipping through, I found the number for the local funeral home listed in the notice. I dialed it with hands that didn't tremble but felt strangely detached from the rest of me. A woman answered. Her voice was soft and composed, the tone of someone trained to soothe grief-stricken callers. I asked her to confirm if Gerald Myers had been cremated at their facility. There was a pause, just a beat too long, and then she said yes. The cremation had occurred 2 days ago at the request of the daughter. Melissa Myers? I asked. Another pause. That's correct, sir. I thanked her and hung up before my voice could betray the roar building in my chest. I needed answers. I called Melissa's number, the one I had dialed hundreds of times, the one I knew by heart. The line rang once, twice, then went directly to a mechanical voice. This number is no longer in service. No forwarding number. No voicemail option. Just a deadline, like I had been unplugged from her life entirely. I tried her office. A receptionist answered and informed me that Melissa was currently on extended leave. Extended, not temporary, not vacation, leave. She didn't say why. She didn't need to. I sat for a long time in the living room after that, the Gazette still open on the table, the obituary staring up like a verdict. I traced the printed letters of my own name with my finger, as if trying to read Braille, to feel the truth under the ink. I wasn't just dead to Melissa. I had been made legally dead, declared so with documents, with a false location, with a false event. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a clerical error. This was deliberate. This was a decision. I drove to the Golden Pines care home listed in the notice. It was an hour and a half away, nestled near the state line. The receptionist was young, perhaps early 20s, and when I introduced myself as Gerald Myers, her face drained of color. "That's not possible," she whispered. I mean, we already filed the death paperwork." I asked if I could see the file or at least the intake documents. She looked nervously toward the office behind her and said she'd need to get the director. 10 minutes later, an older man in a navy sweater vest emerged, looking more annoyed than alarmed. I introduced myself again, calmly this time, though inside I was thrumming with restrained fury. He asked for ID. I gave him my driver's license. He looked at it, then back at me, then at the young receptionist. "We were told you had passed in our hospice wing. Signed release, death certificate, cremation order, all by next of kin. And you didn't find it odd that no one from your staff ever met me?" I asked, voice low and steady. "All arrangements were made remotely," he said, his discomfort now visible. Everything was prepaid. We assumed the daughter was handling it to minimize distress. I asked who signed the documents. He showed me a photocopy. The signature said Gerald A. Myers. The handwriting was not mine. I could see that in a second. It was slanted and rounded, nothing like the precise, left-leaning script I had developed from decades of writing on chalkboards. I pointed at it. "That's forgery," I said. He paled. We had no reason to doubt. She sent ID copies, a medical report from a clinic. Everything looked authentic. "Which clinic?" I asked. He told me the name. It was in Albany. I left without another word, drove back in silence, my knuckles weight on the steering wheel. When I got home, I locked the door for the first time in months and sat in my armchair with the Gazette on my lap, as if rereading my own obituary might make sense of it. But it didn't. Nothing did. Someone had faked my death. Someone who had access to my personal information. Someone who had power of attorney, or claimed to. Someone who stood to benefit. The next morning, I went to my bank. I sat down with Eleanor, the branch manager who had known me for 20 years. When I told her what had happened, she looked at me like I was recounting a ghost story. "You're supposed to be dead," she said quietly, scrolling through her screen. "Your account was closed 3 days ago, transferred to a beneficiary account in Melissa's name." "I didn't authorize that," I said. She nodded. "It was authorized with a certified death certificate. I'm so sorry, Gerald." My hands were shaking now. Not from fear, but from rage. I asked if I could see the certificate. She printed a copy. I held it in my hands, studied the embossed seal, the signature from some doctor I'd never heard of, from a clinic I'd never visited. Date of death, 4 days ago. Cause, cardiac arrest during sleep. Place, Golden Pines, care home. It was airtight, perfectly arranged, and utterly false. I looked at Eleanor, who still couldn't believe what she was seeing. "I need to file a fraud report," I said, "and I need you to block any and all access Melissa has to any of my accounts." She nodded. "Immediately, and I'll flag your name with the state identity system. You'll need to go to the town clerk to reinstate your legal status. Right now, on paper, you're deceased." Deceased? It kept echoing in my head. Deceased. Obsolete. Voiceless. By the end of the day, I had visited 3 offices, filed a formal police report, contacted a lawyer, and stood in line at the DMV to get a reissued ID. Every clerk gave me the same look, half curiosity, half disbelief. One woman even asked if this was some kind of prank. I had to point to the Gazette in my hand and say, "Would you joke about this?" She fell silent. But perhaps the most surreal moment came late that night, when I turned on my laptop and typed my own name into a search engine. The first result was my obituary. The second was an event listing. "In loving memory of Gerald Myers, a celebration of life, hosted in Albany, hosted by Melissa Myers. Open bar, catering by a well-known local chef. Dress code, semi-formal. Date, next Saturday." It was not just an obituary. It was a celebration, a party. My death was being turned into a social event, a networking opportunity, and I had not even been invited. That night I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat in my study, the smallest room in the house, where the air always carried a faint scent of paper and varnished wood, and I stared at the screen until my eyes stung. Every few minutes I refreshed the page where the celebration of life for Gerald Myers was advertised. The event description hadn't changed. It still read like a promotional brochure for a wedding reception. "Join us as we honor the remarkable life of educator and father, Gerald A. Myers. Cocktails at 6, remembrances at 7. Dinner served at 8. There were even RSVP links, which suggested it would be a sizable gathering, not some private affair among grief-stricken loved ones. No, this was something else entirely, an orchestrated, curated production. A performance of mourning without the inconvenience of an actual death. I tried to rationalize it at first. Maybe Melissa had lost her mind. Maybe there had been some catastrophic misunderstanding, or perhaps this was some symbolic event, an emotional closure for her, a way to process our strained relationship through pageantry. But every time I entertained that idea, it collapsed under the weight of hard facts. The fake death certificate, the bank transfers, the cremation papers from a funeral home that had never seen a body, all of it pointed to careful, legalistic intent. This was fraud, and not the clumsy kind. It had been coordinated with surgical precision. Someone had planned this. Melissa had planned this. What troubled me most wasn't the fraud itself, though that was heinous enough. What truly chilled me was that she had done it believing, with apparent confidence, that I would not discover it, that I would be too senile, too housebound, too isolated to notice or to fight back. That I wouldn't matter, that I was already irrelevant, and perhaps, in her mind, already gone. She had counted on my inertia, counted on the world's indifference to the forgotten lives of the elderly. By morning, the disbelief had burned away and left only resolve. I showered, shaved, and dressed carefully, not out of vanity, but because I wanted to see myself as something more than a name on a certificate. I was not a memory. Not yet. I put on my old navy blazer, the one with the elbow patches Margaret used to tease me about, and I walked into town to see my attorney, Edwin Marks. He'd handled my will years ago and Margaret's estate after her death. He was older now, heavier, with shaky hands, but still sharp. When I walked into his office and said, "According to the state, I'm dead," he blinked twice, then gestured to the chair across from him and said, "Well, that's a hell of a way to start a meeting." We went over the documents I had printed. The Gazette, obituary, the death certificate, the event flyer, the bank statements. Edwin grew paler with each page. He read everything slowly, twice as if trying to find a trick in the wording that would make this all disappear. But there was no trick. There was only intent. When he finally looked up, his voice was quiet but steady. "She's committed felony-level fraud," he said. "If we report this, she could be facing prison time. And if you want, Gerald, I'll make sure that happens." I nodded slowly, but something in my gut twisted at the thought. Prison? For my daughter? The little girl who used to bring me finger paintings and mispronounce the word spaghetti as spaghetti. I couldn't reconcile that child with the woman who had forged my death and emptied my accounts, but she was that woman now. Sentiment would not unmake the choices she had made. Edwin asked if I wanted to press criminal charges or begin with a civil suit to reclaim my identity and assets. I told him we'd start with restoration, get me back to the land of the living, legally speaking, and that we'd take it from there. The next stop was the town clerk's office, where I filed an affidavit contesting the death certificate. That alone took 2 hours, because no one there had ever reversed a death. One woman kept asking if I was sure I wasn't confusing myself with a relative who had passed. Another suggested I was a twin. When I showed them my ID, medical records, utility bills, and photos taken within the past week, they finally relented and marked the case as pending investigation. I was told that the certificate would be temporarily suspended, not revoked until the state completed a full inquiry. In the meantime, I remained technically deceased. It was like being a ghost who could speak and walk but not own property or vote or prove who he was. I existed in limbo, but limbo at least had movement. I wasn't buried, I wasn't gone, and I wasn't done. 2 days later, I did something I never thought I'd do. I drove to Albany. The drive took nearly 3 hours, my knees aching the entire way, but I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed to look at the world my daughter had constructed on the assumption that I was no longer part of it. The event was being held in a large rented hall attached to a boutique hotel. The place had valet parking, tall glass windows, and floral arrangements spilling out the front door. As I pulled into a spot across the street, I saw guests beginning to arrive. Well-dressed men and women, all smiles and small talk, hugging each other and posing for photos in front of a printed banner that said, in elegant cursive, "In loving memory of Gerald Myers." I stayed in the car for a long time, watching them. It wasn't grief I saw. It was performance. People greeting Melissa with sympathetic embraces, then laughing about work, passing drinks, and asking which table they'd been assigned. It was a networking gala masquerading as a funeral. And in the middle of it all, there she was, my daughter. Melissa, dressed in a charcoal gray cocktail dress with pearls, her hair pulled into a tight bun, receiving condolences with a practiced solemnity that vanished the moment the guest turned away. I waited until the crowd thickened and then I stepped out of the car. The doorman barely glanced at me. I walked up the marble steps, pushed open the doors, and entered my own wake. The reaction was not immediate. At first, people looked at me with polite disinterest, assuming I was some elderly guest who had wandered in late. But then someone whispered. Then another turned their head. I saw a woman clutch her husband's arm and mutter something. And then, like a virus, the recognition spread. Faces turned, voices dropped. And finally, Melissa turned around, a glass of wine in her hand and a frozen smile on her face. Our eyes met. She didn't drop the glass. She didn't scream. What she did was worse. She smiled wider, as if she'd seen an old friend she hadn't expected. "Daddy," she said, loud enough for those near her to hear. "You made it after all. You made it, after all, as if I had been invited. As if I hadn't spent the last week resurrecting myself from a bureaucratic grave she had dug." There was a stunned silence. Guests glanced between us, unsure whether this was part of the event. Melissa stepped toward me, slow and calculated, and took my arm. "Let's talk outside," she said through clenched teeth. Once we were outside, the facade dropped. "What the hell are you doing here?" she hissed. "What am I doing here?" I said. "I thought I was dead. Just came back to see how the afterlife treats a man." She didn't flinch. That was the part that cut deepest. She didn't cry, didn't apologize, didn't even act surprised. "You weren't supposed to find out," she said. "Not like this." "Then how?" I asked. "When were you going to let me know I'd died?" She looked away. "I needed the money," she said finally. "The house, the accounts. I was drowning." "You don't understand what it's like. You could have asked. You would have said no." I stared at her, the woman my wife and I had raised who once needed help tying her shoes, who used to sneak cookies from the jar and swear she hadn't. "You didn't even check if I was okay." "You're old, Dad. You barely leave the house. I thought it would be easier." "For who?" I asked. She didn't answer. And in that silence I understood everything I needed to. She had already buried me in her heart long before she filed the paperwork. She had decided I was finished, surplus, an obstacle to be resolved with signatures and ashes that didn't even belong to me. "I'm going to the police," I said. "Then go," she said, her voice steady now. "But ask yourself what you want out of this. Justice, revenge, or peace?" Peace. It was a word Margaret used often, but this wasn't peace. This was something colder. This was war. The next morning, I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the worn carpet that had outlived both Margaret and whatever illusion I'd had of still belonging to my daughter's world. The events of the previous night replayed in my mind with unbearable clarity. Melissa's calm defiance, her indifference to the fact that she had committed a crime not just against the law, but against decency, against blood, against memory itself. I had walked into my own memorial service like a ghost with unfinished business, and instead of horror or shame, I had been met with diplomatic horror, hushed whispers, and the stubborn refusal of a daughter to even look shaken. She hadn't tried to explain. She hadn't tried to undo. Her first instinct had been control. Steer me out of sight, contain the damage, recast the narrative. I wasn't her father anymore. I was an inconvenience, a narrative threat to her performance of bereavement. By midday, I was in Edwin's office again, this time with a renewed urgency. He had already begun the process of filing for civil damages, reinstating my accounts, freezing the ones in Melissa's name, requesting an injunction to prevent the dispersal of my assets. But I now wanted to escalate. I wanted to bring criminal charges. Fraud, forgery, identity theft, financial exploitation of a senior. There were multiple avenues, and I was ready to pursue them all. Edwin, for all his experience, looked at me with hesitation. "Gerald," he said slowly, "if you go down this road, there's no turning back. It'll go public. It'll ruin her reputation, her career, maybe her life." I nodded. She already tried to erase mine. That ended the discussion. As the legal wheels began to turn, I also started repairing my own legal identity. The court required affidavits from witnesses who had seen me alive within the last few weeks. I drove back to the bank and the hardware store, and even to old Mrs. Lentz, my neighbor who always complained about the way my maple tree leaned too far over her fence. They all agreed to sign. It was surreal, having to prove that I was, in fact, alive, that I hadn't passed quietly in my sleep like the forged papers claimed. There was something grotesque about it, like trying to claw your way out of a coffin someone else had nailed shut. Meanwhile, Melissa remained silent. No calls, no messages. She didn't contest the account freezes. She didn't return Edwin's letters. It was as if she'd already decided the damage was irreversible and had gone underground, hoping to delay the consequences long enough to regroup. I could only imagine the conversations she was having with lawyers of her own. Maybe she was concocting a story about mental decline, about confusion, about some perceived dementia that she would say prompted her to act. Or maybe, and this terrified me, she was already preparing another forged affidavit, this time declaring me legally incompetent, not deceased. If she could convince a judge that I was no longer of sound mind, she might reclaim guardianship and retake control of my assets. She'd done it once. She could try again. So I took steps. I scheduled a full cognitive assessment with Dr. Harry Lindstrom, a neurologist I trusted who had treated Margaret during her illness. After a battery of tests, he shook my hand and said, "You're sharper than half my staff." I had his findings notarized and filed with the court just in case. I also wrote a personal statement, a kind of living will, not about my belongings but about my memories. I wanted it on record, that I remembered everything. My wedding day, the birth of Melissa, the smell of Margaret's hair after a rainstorm. I remembered the history I had taught, the decades I had lived, the names of students who had passed through my classroom. I remembered my life, and I wasn't going to let anyone rewrite the ending. Then, just as I had begun to settle into the rhythm of legal procedures and paperwork, the twist came. One afternoon, as I returned from the courthouse, I found an envelope taped to my front door. No return address. Inside was a single page, a printout of what looked like an email thread. The names had been redacted, but the message was unmistakably from Melissa. The subject line, "Need to finalize Dad's will." The body of the message made my skin crawl. I can get his signature. He still leaves his checkbook on the hallway table. I'll take a photo of it, match the pen. We'll backdate to February 12th. I want the language clean. Everything to me, no public notice. If anyone asks, I'll say he insisted on privacy. He's been forgetful lately. No one will question it. Below that, another message. Understood. But this crosses the line. Are you sure he won't notice? Melissa's reply. He won't. I've been planting the seed. Took the batteries out of his smoke detector last week and told him it was his memory. Switched the meds in his bathroom. If he ever ends up in a clinic, this email never existed. I stared at the page until my vision blurred. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with something deeper, colder, older. Betrayal was not just a theft. It was desecration. It was the hollowing out of a bond once sacred. I hadn't just been declared dead. I had been hunted, prepared, softened for the kill. My own daughter had treated me like prey. She had manipulated my routines, tampered with my medications, rehearsed my confusion for an audience of future witnesses. And it had worked. For a while, it had worked. I took the letter to Edwin. His jaw tightened as he read it. "This is nuclear," he said. "If we can trace the sender, this becomes irrefutable evidence of premeditated elder abuse and attempted fraud." "But who sent it?" I asked. It wasn't Melissa. Someone wanted me to see this. It didn't take long to find out. A week later, we received a confidential statement from a woman named Carla Mendel. She had worked for Melissa's company as an assistant and had been asked to clean up files before Melissa's temporary leave. In doing so, she had come across the thread and, realizing its gravity, printed it before it could be deleted. "I couldn't stay quiet," she wrote. "My grandfather was taken advantage of in a similar way. I couldn't let her get away with it." It was the turning point. The court now had cause not only to reinstate me, but to investigate Melissa for criminal elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. The judge issued a protective order preventing her from contacting me directly. And just like that, the woman who had planned a party for my memory became the subject of a criminal probe that would define her legacy far more than any eulogy ever could. But I didn't feel vindicated. Not yet. The investigation moved faster than I anticipated. Perhaps it was the email printout. Perhaps it was the notarized testimony from Carla Mendel, the former assistant who had dared to send me the message Melissa had wanted erased. Or perhaps it was because what Melissa had done was too ugly, even for a bureaucratic system accustomed to gray morality. Either way, within weeks of filing the affidavit, a grand jury was convened, and the state attorney began assembling a formal case against her. I received the news sitting alone in the kitchen, the same chair I had collapsed into the day I read my own obituary. But this time, I didn't feel stunned. I felt the weight of something terrible shifting into motion. Not justice yet, but inertia, as if the world was finally catching up to what I already knew. That my daughter hadn't simply tried to cheat me out of a bank account, or even a house. She had tried to erase my final years of personhood, convert my dignity into liquidity, my memory into a eulogy she could deliver while sipping wine in a cocktail dress. She had tried to kill the part of me that still wanted to live. It wasn't long before things began unraveling for her. Her firm placed her on indefinite leave, then released a formal statement distancing themselves from her personal conduct. An anonymous source leaked the fact that she had used her company's office resources to draft and print forged legal documents, an act that, though minor compared to the rest, confirmed just how deeply entwined her deception was with her daily life. What shocked me wasn't just the scope of her betrayal, it was the precision. She had fabricated a death certificate, staged a cremation, rerouted my mail, closed my bank accounts, and even begun the process of selling the house I still occupied. Had I missed a single piece of mail, had I not gone to the bank when I did, it's likely I would have woken one morning to strangers knocking on the door with ownership papers in hand, and nowhere to go but a shelter or hospice. What became clearer during the investigation was that Melissa hadn't acted alone. The doctor who had signed the false certificate, Dr. Leora Jennings, was a college friend of hers working at a private practice in Albany that catered to discreet clientele. Jennings initially claimed that she had been misled, that she thought she was helping expedite paperwork for a dying man with no next of kin. But when investigators cross-checked their emails, they found a chain of messages in which Melissa explicitly coached her on the narrative. He's got early dementia, lives alone, barely leaves the house, no family nearby. You won't need to meet him. Just say he passed in sleep. We'll handle the rest. That alone could have earned her a felony charge, but it got worse. One of the investigators from the state's Elder Protection Unit contacted me directly with a request. Could they search my house for evidence of tampering, medications, documents, anything that would support the theory that Melissa had been actively destabilizing my mental state in the months before she declared me dead? I agreed. What they found chilled me. 2 bottles of my old heart medication, switched with over-the-counter calcium pills, a bottle of magnesium labeled as a beta blocker, prescriptions I didn't remember filling, dates I didn't recognize, dosages that were dangerously high or pointlessly low. It explained the confusion I'd been feeling earlier that year, the fatigue, the brain fog, the sense that something in my body was off-kilter but invisible. I had blamed aging. I had blamed grief. I had never thought to blame my daughter. They bagged the items, took photographs, and filed them into evidence. The turning point came when I was approached by a journalist from the Albany Ledger, a thin, soft-spoken woman named Fiona Ash, who had heard whispers of the case from someone on the court staff. She asked if I would speak to her, off the record at first, to tell my side. I was reluctant. I didn't want this to be some sordid spectacle. But after a night of pacing, I realized Melissa had already made a spectacle out of my absence. It was time I made a statement with my presence. I met with Fiona at a coffee shop 2 towns over, where I told her the entire story, from the moment I saw my name in the paper to the confrontation at the memorial party. I expected her to interrupt, to take notes furiously, to insert skepticism. She didn't. She listened, pen in hand, saying almost nothing until I was done. When I finished, she folded her notebook and said, "You're not just a victim, Mr. Myers. You're a survivor. And people need to hear that." Her article came out a week later, front page, with a black and white photo of me standing in front of my house, arms crossed, the Gazette obituary folded in one hand. The headline read, "Dead Man Talking: How Gerald Myers Exposed a Family Fraud from the Grave." It was concise, sharp, respectful, and devastating. The article went viral locally, then spread to regional papers and online forums that tracked elder abuse and legal manipulation. I began receiving letters, dozens at first, then hundreds, from strangers, some in their 50s and 60s who feared their children would one day turn on them. Others from caregivers who had witnessed similar schemes but hadn't known what to do. And some from people like me, men and women in their 70s and 80s, alone, forgotten, seen as burdens to be managed or removed. They wrote to say thank you. They wrote to say, "You're not alone." But not all the letters were supportive. A handful were anonymous, typed, filled with vitriol. One accused me of lying to get attention, of framing an innocent woman. Another said I had probably abused Melissa in secret, that maybe I deserved it. Those letters I burned. Not because they wounded me, but because I refused to give them shelf space beside the words of those who saw the truth. Still, they reminded me that even truth carries a cost. There would always be people willing to defend the abuser if she wore the right clothes and used the right tone. The preliminary hearing was set for early spring. Melissa did not appear in person. Her lawyers entered a plea of not guilty and requested dismissal of several charges on procedural grounds. The judge denied all motions. The prosecution submitted witness lists, including Carla Mendel, the funeral director who had accepted the fake documents, Dr. Jennings, and myself. Edwin advised me to be ready for public testimony, possibly a full jury trial. I asked if I could make a statement to the court, even if I wasn't called to the stand formally. He said yes, but cautioned me. Once you speak, you can't unspeak it. I spent a week writing that statement. It wasn't long, just a few pages. But every sentence was carved, not written. Carved from marrow, carved from silence. I talked about what it means to be a father. About watching your child grow up with hope in her eyes and then seeing that hope curdle into calculation. I talked about trust, about the soft erosion that happens when someone close to you stops seeing you as human and starts seeing you as an obstacle. I talked about the thousands of elderly people who die each year in this country, not from illness but from neglect, from erasure, from quiet betrayals that never make headlines. I ended by saying, if my name has become a cautionary tale, then so be it. But I won't be quiet. I won't go back to the grave you tried to put me in. The judge accepted the statement into the record. The courtroom was cold to the day it was read aloud. Melissa sat there for once with no mask, no deflection. Just pale, rigid silence. She didn't look at me. Not once. And I didn't look away. The day of the trial was colder than the calendar suggested it should be, and the wind had that thin, sharp quality that seems to slice through even the warmest coat. I wore my best clothes, the same navy blazer with Margaret's favorite silver tie, a tie she used to call my honest man ribbon, a phrase she invented during our 3rd year of marriage when we were still young and played at being grown-ups. I arrived at the courthouse an hour early, not because I needed the time, but because I couldn't bear the thought of being late to my own reckoning. There was something ceremonial about it all. Walking up those stone steps, past the officers at the door, past the strangers whispering in corners about the old man who had risen from the dead to testify against his daughter. I felt their glances, but didn't return them. I had no room for shame left. Melissa had already taken it, repurposed it, twisted it into a mask she wore in public with elegance and ease. All I had left was truth, and I would not dress it in politeness. Inside, the courtroom was filled but hushed. A small group of reporters sat clustered near the back, notebooks ready. Carla Mendel sat in the 3rd row, pale but firm, a silent shield to the story she had helped reveal. Edwin stood at my side as we watched Melissa enter. She wore a black suit, hair down, makeup subdued, but the illusion of grief no longer suited her. She looked more like a woman on the edge of being found out, posture rigid, mouth set like a hinge about to snap. She avoided my gaze as if I were radioactive. And maybe I was. Maybe the truth, when spoken aloud, carries a kind of radiation too dangerous for those who tried to bury it. The prosecution laid out its case with a cold elegance that mirrored Melissa's original fraud. Emails, bank records, medication swaps, forged signatures, falsified medical reports, the pre-written obituary, the cremation receipt for a body that wasn't mine. Each item was displayed like a relic from a story too bizarre to be fiction. And then came the final piece, the printout of her message planning my death, her casual acknowledgement of how easily she could orchestrate the dismantling of a life while smiling through brunch meetings and client pitches. The room was silent when it was read aloud. Even the judge's gavel seemed unnecessary. There was no disorder to contain, only collective revulsion, the kind that seeps into walls and lingers long after court adjourns. When it came time for my testimony, Edwin nodded at me gently, and I stood. My legs ached, but I refused help. The oath felt redundant. What could I swear to that hadn't already cost me everything I had left of family? But I raised my hand anyway, and when I sat in the witness box, I looked not at the jury, not at the attorneys, but directly at Melissa. She did not look away, but there was no recognition in her face, only calculation, as if measuring the damage. I spoke slowly, but not weakly. I described the moment I read my own obituary, how I walked into a bank only to be told I no longer existed, how I sat in a funeral home holding a death certificate with my name, issued by a doctor I had never met. I talked about the medications swapped in my cabinet, the nights I sat confused, wondering if my mind was finally giving way, not knowing that confusion was being manufactured for a purpose. I described how I had been mourned without consent, celebrated without truth, and robbed without confrontation. And then I told them what hurt most. Not the money, not the near eviction, not even the public degradation of having to prove I was alive to a system that had already filed me away, but the knowledge that my daughter, my only child, had looked at my vulnerability and seen an opportunity instead of a father, that she had turned legacy into leverage. I said these words clearly without dramatic pause because I did not want their power to come from delivery, but from their terrible simplicity. Melissa did not react. Her face remained unreadable, but I saw the corner of her mouth twitch once. Whether from contempt or control, I couldn't say. I stepped down after finishing my statement and did not look back at the judge or jury. I did not need their validation. I had not come for pity or applause. I had come to reclaim what had been stolen without bullets or fists, my name, my history, and the truth of what had been done to me in the silence of polite society. That afternoon, Melissa's defense team attempted a weak counter. She had been under stress. She believed I was becoming increasingly unstable. She thought she was protecting me. She acted out of love. The judge stopped them midway through their closing and asked one simple question. If he was so unstable, why not speak to the court? Why not get an official diagnosis? Why file a death certificate instead? There was no answer. The verdict came quickly. Guilty on all major counts: fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, criminal conspiracy. Sentencing was postponed for final psychological evaluations, but the judge revoked her bail on the spot. I watched her being led out in cuffs, hands bound in front of her like a child who had lost the last game and wanted to flip the board. She did not cry. She did not plead. She walked like someone who still believed the world would make space for her version of the story, even now. As the door closed behind her, the room exhaled. I did not. I stood quietly, holding my hat in both hands, and waited for the silence to settle. It did. Slowly, like dust after a demolition. Only then did I turn and walk out, past reporters, past curious eyes, past a world that was beginning to remember me, not as the man who had once taught their children, but as the man who had lived to tell the truth when no one expected him to. After the trial, I returned to my house not as a man reclaimed, but as a man emptied. There was no applause waiting for me, no warm welcome from neighbors with casseroles, no grand exhale of relief. There was only silence, the same silence that had filled the rooms for years, only now it carried a different weight, not absence, but aftermath. I moved through the house slowly that first night, turning on lamps one by one as if to convince myself that light still had meaning. The couch, the teacups, the framed photos on the mantel, all of it unchanged. And yet, everything was different. Melissa had not just tried to steal from me. She had tried to rewrite the meaning of this place, my home, my life. She had tried to file me away like a folder in a drawer she no longer needed to open. But the folder had resisted. For weeks after the sentencing, I received calls from people I hadn't heard from in years. Former students, now in their 60s, wrote me letters. One even drove 4 hours just to shake my hand and say, "You were right about Nixon, by the way." A small newspaper from another state asked to reprint the Ledger story. I declined, not because I was ashamed of it, but because I didn't want the pain turned into content. What had happened wasn't a story. It was a wound that was still closing. Melissa was sentenced to a 5-year suspended sentence with 2 years of house arrest, 5 years of probation, and full restitution. She avoided prison by pleading guilty, offering a formal apology in court, a dry, perfunctory statement written by her attorneys, which the judge accepted but did not commend. I didn't attend the sentencing. I knew she wouldn't say anything that wasn't calculated, and I had no desire to see her reduced to a spectacle in orange. Instead, I stayed home and listened to Margaret's old records, letting the sound of Ella Fitzgerald fill the corners of the house like a balm. The court ordered her to return every dollar, including the funds used to pay for the fraudulent cremation. I watched as the legal system did its quiet arithmetic: subtract, restore, reassign. But what could not be calculated was the trust that had been dissolved, the bond that had been cauterized beyond repair. Melissa sent me one handwritten letter during her probation. It arrived in a thick envelope, folded precisely. Inside, she wrote that she didn't expect forgiveness, but she hoped one day I'd see that what she did came from desperation, not hatred. She wrote that she had been drowning in debts, that her business was failing, that she saw the inheritance not as theft, but as a rescue. She wrote that she still loved me, in her own way. I read the letter once. Then I placed it in the fireplace and lit a match. I don't know what became of her after that. I didn't follow her case, didn't check her LinkedIn, didn't ask Edwin to keep me informed. I let her go, not with vengeance, but with finality. She had made her choice, and I had made mine. Some doors, once closed, are not meant to open again. In the spring, I sold the house. Not because I couldn't bear to live in it anymore, but because I wanted to choose a new ending for myself. I moved to a smaller place near Lake Willoughby, where the air is clear and the days are quiet. I planted a small vegetable garden. I started journaling again. I even adopted a dog, a mutt named Rufus with crooked teeth and a limp, who follows me from room to room like I'm the last good thing he's ever known. We take walks every morning. Sometimes we pass couples my age, sometimes young families. They don't know who I am, and I like it that way. A month ago, I received a letter in a handwriting I didn't recognize. It was from a young woman named Audrey, a 21-year-old college student from New Hampshire. She said she believed she was my granddaughter, that her mother, Sarah, had known me briefly in 1973, before I met Margaret. She had read about me online, seen the story, and wanted to reach out, not for money, not for answers, but just to say she existed, and that she hoped I was well. She enclosed a photo, a young woman with brown eyes and a crooked smile that looked strangely familiar. I wrote her back. I didn't promise anything. I didn't deny anything either. I simply said I was here. And if she ever wanted to visit, there was always coffee brewing before 8 a.m., and a dog who wouldn't mind the company. Some people think justice is about punishment. I used to think that too, but now I know that real justice is quieter. It's choosing to live after someone tried to write your ending for you. It's speaking your name when others tried to silence it. It's waking up each morning, making toast, putting on your shoes, and stepping into the world with your head high, not because everything is fixed, but because you refused to stay buried. My name is Gerald Myers, and I am not gone.